Okay, guys, we're going to be looking at indicator 5.4. Again, this is probably going to be a lot of review, especially from last year with the world history part. Today, we're going to focus more on the U.S. History part of World War I and how it impacts the United States. But this video may be broken into two parts, so this will be probably part one of the video. So we'll start with looking at a few of the things that got us involved in the war, some of the things that led up to the war, and then when the war starts. And then that will probably be the end of part one. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into indicator 5.4. Of course, last year in world history, you learned Maine. Of course, we can make it into all kinds of different acronyms, but in this case, we're going to use something called mania, and these were the causes of World War I. Of course, the M stands for militarism. Remember that militarism was the buildup of military forces preparing to fight for war. Alliance system, of course, a lot of these countries in Europe had formed these secret alliances that are eventually going to lead to this war. So the alliance system is the letter A, and these were agreements to aid and protect one another. So if one attacked another country, then another country would come in and step in and get involved. So because of all these alliances, it's going to really trigger this world war. Of course, N stands for nationalism, a sense of pride in one's country, which we know that definition by now. Nationalism had begun to rise in a lot of these countries, especially in Europe. These countries wanted to be their own country. They didn't want to be controlled by these huge empires by this point. And of course, that is going to be a key contributing factor. Again, nationalism, pride, and devotion to one's country. The I stands for imperialism, which is what we've been talking about over the last few weeks. Imperialism, remember, going out and asserting yourself over other countries, having domination over those countries, and so on. So imperialism, extending your power and control over other countries. And then the final thing would have been the A, and the A stands for assassination. And we all know by now, especially from last year, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is what's going to lead to this war starting. It is the spark that starts the war. Again, murder of Austria's heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, again, is the spark of this war. It happens in a place called Sarajevo, which used to be in what used to be the former communist country called Yugoslavia. So a couple things, too, that you need to keep in mind as the military begins to build. Spending on defense in 1914 was $398 million. That's leading up to the start of the war. Of course, the war apparently had been building for many countries, and a lot of these countries were prepping in case it did occur. It had been $289 million in 1910. From 1910 to 1914, France increased their defense expenditure by almost 10%. Britain had increased it by 13%. Russia had increased by 39%. And the one with the biggest gain is going to be Germany. They increased their military spending by up to 73%. So it was pretty obvious that Germany was preparing for war. Let's look at what sides were what. Of course, we're going to start looking at the Allied powers. Those countries included Great Britain, France, and Russia. Last year, we talked a little bit about the alliance, the Triple Entente, and the Triple Alliance. This is the Triple Entente. And then, of course, for the Central Powers, it is going to be Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And remember, we said last year, too, that Italy would eventually switch sides and join the Allies. Again, these countries are going to square off, which is why it's called a world war. You had so many countries involved that had alliances with other countries that drug some other countries into this, and this war is going to be considered the very first World War. Again, here's a map showing you the alliances, the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. We've seen this map before, but you can take a quick look at it and sort of get an idea about where these countries are in Europe and how they were situated as this war begins in 1914. The spark, of course, we called the Balkans the powder keg of Europe. Remember, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand is going to trigger this whole thing. He had been visiting Bosnia to annex it. So his visit is going to be viewed by the Serbians, who saw the Archduke being there as a way of them extending their power over that area of the Balkans. Some of the Serbian nationalists took exception, and they thought that Serbia was their rightful land, or that part of Bosnia was their rightful land, and therefore they were willing to strike. This idea was extreme nationalism, and this extreme nationalism is what's going to lead to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Gavrilo Princip would be the guy that would do it in June of 1914. So the Serbians did not want to be controlled by Austria-Hungary. They wanted to be their own country. They didn't want Bosnia annexed. Therefore, they pushed for Gavrilo Princip to actually commit the assassination. Gavrilo Princip, of course, this also from world history last year, was a member of a group, a nationalist group called the Black Hand. It was considered to be a Serbian terrorist group. Again, here's a picture, shows Gavrilo Princip shooting the Archduke and his wife Sophie, falling over her husband's body, which you can see here in this picture. More actual pictures. There's a picture of Gavrilo Princip being subdued. And then, of course, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a picture of the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, on that trip into Sarajevo. Again, bottom right-hand picture is of Gavrilo Princip. Once this whole event happens, it triggers one right after the other. And of course, Serbia had an alliance with Russia. Austria had an alliance with Germany. And then, of course, France and Great Britain would eventually get involved too. This is what's going to trigger this war and cause it to escalate pretty quickly. So some of the action in the Balkans. Area of concern was Bosnia. Of course, why? It's because Bosnia didn't necessarily want to be part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary wanted to build an empire. Serbia claimed it was their historical ethnic land. Most of the people spoke the same language. Their culture was the same. Therefore, they didn't think that Austria and Hungary should take over Bosnia. Russia is going to view themselves as the father and protector of all these lands, as it was in close proximity to Russia, and because they felt that those people were very similar to the Russians. So let's look at the U.S. involvement in World War I. Initially, the United States is going to try to stay out of this war. They declared neutrality, but eventually that's going to fall apart. Neutrality was hard because of a couple of reasons. Number one, the United States had so much trade that was going on with Great Britain, who was involved in the war. It really put pressure on that alliance. The United States wanted to continue trading with Britain, but it was sort of hard, doing that if they weren't actually backing Britain in this war. Great Britain also was blockading German ports, which the United States also had some trade with Germany. So again, both sides being affected, and American businesses made loans to allies. They were, giving them money to help them in the war. And of course, the countries that weren't receiving the money naturally became hostile towards the United States. The other thing that was going on was German submarine warfare, or unrestricted submarine warfare, that the Germans used at the beginning of the war and would continue pretty much throughout, with the exception of about a year or so where they quit. Unrestricted submarine warfare pretty much meant that any boat in the water that the Germans were willing to sink without any warning, without telling them, they would just pop up, shoot them, and that was it. The German submarine was called the U-boat, and they used torpedoes to sink these ships. Because Germany was using this unrestricted warfare, submarine warfare, without warning and without notice, people in the United States began to resent Germany. The first action that really got the United States fired up was the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania. It was a British passenger ship. It had over 100 Americans on board when it was sunk. It was sunk by the Germans in May of 1915. In case you didn't know, this Lusitania was a sister ship of the Titanic, which also sank, so it's sort of coincidental that both ships are at the bottom of the ocean. The United States had an outcry after this, and of course, Germany is going to be, sort of criticized throughout the world for doing these things. Eventually leads to something called the Sussex Pledge. A ship called the Sussex had been sunk, and Germany comes back and says, "Okay, we'll stop sinking your ships. We will, approach, and as long as there's no contraband or weapons on board, then we won't sink it. We'll let it pass. But if there is, then we're gonna sink that ship." So that went on for a little while until the beginning of 1917. Again, Germany was afraid of the U.S. getting involved in late 1915 and early 1916. More the reason why they stopped the unrestricted submarine warfare for a little bit. It was later revealed that the Lusitania did have wartime supplies on that ship. So the Germans were right in claiming that the Lusitania was carrying weapons, and of course they sank it. And the United States was upset about it, but again, the Germans knew that they were carrying contraband or weapons that would help the other side. The next thing that's going to bring the United States into this war is something known as the Zimmermann Telegram, which was discussed in detail last year. It was a secret message that was sent by Germany to Mexico, asking Mexico to join the war. And if they did, then the Germans were going to grant them land that the United States had gotten during the time of the Mexican War, mainly the southwestern states. This was the final straw that's going to lead the United States into entering into World War I. Again, here's the actual telegram. It was intercepted by the British and then turned over to the United States. And of course, the British were more than happy to turn over the Zimmermann Telegram and to get the United States involved. They knew if they had the United States on their side, then it could result in a huge victory in World War I, and the British were right. Again, this is an actual picture of the decoded message after they had broke it down, and you can read it real quick. If you want to pause the video and read the entire thing, you may. But again, here's the telegram, the Zimmermann Telegram, in detail decoded. In early 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare resumes. Again, another reason why the United States joins the war: the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann Telegram, the use of unrestricted submarine warfare were all reasons why the United States would eventually join the war. Wilson would ask Congress for a declaration of war, and he said that we needed to do this to make the world safe for democracy. And of course, if you remember from the moral diplomacy, one of the things that the United States was all about under Woodrow Wilson was spreading the idea of liberty and democracy throughout the world. And of course, this was Wilson's theme. And so therefore, asking this of Congress was pretty much following up with what he had promised in the past. In April of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. And again, The U.S. is involved. This is going to change the war. One way that we were going to look to get soldiers very quickly was the putting in the institution of the Selective Service Act, or the draft. Um, May of 1917, it was put into place, and again, men from anywhere from ages 21 to 30 years old were asked to register for the draft. And of course, if you don't know what the draft is, it's just simply you have to sign up to join the war, sign up for the Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever it may be. And again, the Selective Service Act is what made that possible in May of 1917. A lot of propaganda was issued during this period. These were propaganda, is ideas spread to influence public opinion for or against the cause. These are just some of the posters that were in this period that were put up to try to get men to enlist, try to get the United States behind the war effort. And of course, these propaganda posters were pretty effective. Some of them were pretty obvious. Some of them were even sort of humorous in some ways, and they often depicted, people in different ways and so on. U.S. were persuaded to do a couple of things during this period: not only enlist in the military, but to also plant victory gardens, which I think you guys have talked about in the past. Also buy war bonds. War bonds, of course, you would buy, and they would earn interest over a period of time. They were donating to the cause. The United States would issue that money back at the end of the war. There's also a lot of anti-German propaganda in the United States, and you can see a few of these posters. The Germans were often portrayed as Huns, and of course, it's showing you a little bit of those reactions to the Germans. You can see some of these are quite funny. Discrimination of Americans with German descent, so anybody from Germany or that had a German background were often discriminated against during this period. The United States even went so far to stop teaching German in schools, restrict German music, rename German foods, and so on. The government takes action. Some ways that the United States was going to crack down during this period was through two things, and you need to know these. One is called the Espionage Act of 1917, and the other is the Sedition Act of 1918. What both of these things, the Alien and Sedition Acts and Espionage Acts, are going to do is you cannot interfere with any military operations. You can't give away information. You can't talk about it, so on. Those were things that were considered in violation of these two new acts. If you were supporting the enemies, and of course it was taken very, very seriously during this time. Any negative speech about the government was also frowned upon and part of this Espionage and Sedition Act. Again, you couldn't speak out really against the government at this point, especially during the war. And you could not interfere with the sale of government bonds. These bonds, of course, were contributing to the war and so on. Wilson had come up with a plan to end the war. He had an idea known as the 14 points. This was Wilson's goal for lasting peace. And of course, here's a few of those things. He believed in freedom of the seas, that the seas were open, end to secret treaties. So these alliances, remember, alliances played a huge role in starting this war. Arms reduction, remember, militarism was one of those causes of the war. These people shouldn't be able to build up their armies and their weapons to such a point to where it leads to war. And of course, he pushed for the idea of self-determination, meaning a country can decide what type of government they would like to be. Of course, Woodrow Wilson was pushing the idea of democracy and liberty for many of these countries after the war. Create an international peace organization, which eventually became the League of Nations. But all of those were things that would be in Wilson's plan to end the war. With that, we're going to stop and we'll pick up the rest in part 2. And again, please make sure that you've got all the notes down and that you've written down the things that you need. and I will catch up with you again on part 2.